Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we're going to be doing our lineups today for the main slate tonight. This starts at 7 o'clock Eastern. We have several really good games today. Cincinnati, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Pittsburgh, New York Mets, and the Yankees. Angels and Tampa Bay, Texas versus Minnesota, St. Louis versus the Cubs, Miami versus Oakland, and Milwaukee versus the Dodgers. So we have a lot of good games here, and so there's definitely going to be some scoring opportunities. There's also some really good pitchers on the mound, so let's go ahead and get into the pitchers, and I'll tell you my top 4 pitchers. So for what I've got today, Max Scherzer, he's definitely the best pitcher on the day. He's actually not even had a bad game all season long. He hasn't had a game under 15 fantasy points. And yeah, he's going against the Yankees, which are a really good team, but they've been really bad as of late. So I feel like that he's a really solid starter, regardless of who he's playing against. You can see his last 10 games averaging 25. Like I said, he hadn't had a bad game, including against the Yankees. Before, he had 23 points. If you're going to get a pitcher, you're almost guaranteed to get, somewhere in the 20s. He's going to be it. He's had one game at 15.5. That's literally it. Every other game has been plus 20 or more. He's super safe. He is expensive though, so you're gonna have to pay down for some other positions to utilize him. But I feel like today, with the lack of great pitchers against easy opponents, it's probably going to be worth just throwing him out there anyway, simply because our top 3 pitchers, price-wise, are all against pretty good opponents. So, with that said, let's go ahead and look at the second pitcher, who is Julio Urias. He's against Milwaukee. He's been kind of hit and miss as of late. He's had a 23-point game against Milwaukee in his last start, in fact, and he's only had a couple bad games on the season. Milwaukee can get hit, but he's one of the only pitchers that I feel like has the opportunity to get 5 or 6 strikeouts. There's a couple guys that might get 5, but between Scherzer and him, I feel like those guys are going to get the most strikeouts. Then I've got 2 other pitchers set up just as options if you want to go cheaper. Probably the best of those options is Edward Cabrera, who's just been really good. He has 6 starts, and 5 of them he's got over 19 fantasy points. So that's really solid. And his bad game was against Houston, which, a lot of people have bad games against Houston. So, but overall, he's been really good otherwise, and even against a couple pretty decent teams. He actually did really good against Colorado, which can be hard to do. And he's done good against Philadelphia and San Diego. So I look at him as an option against Oakland, especially, as a really good option. I will say that Ohtani was against Oakland, and he got lit up yesterday for the first time all season, basically. So who knows? But I still really like him. I think he's a solid choice. So if you want to pay down a little bit off of the top 2 expensive guys, he's probably the best option. The other decent option is Jordan Montgomery for St. Louis. He's not always the best pitcher. He has some upside. He's not always the best, but he does have some good stuff. And so he may give you a bad game though, so you do have to be a little worried. He's probably not going to flash like 30-point upside, but in the last 2 games, he's actually been pretty solid. But I still think that he's a good alternative if you need to pay down. He's just not as safe as Cabrera or Urias and Scherzer. So, pretty much, there's a couple other guys that are kind of decent, but I probably stay away from. Definitely staying away from Eric Lara against the Dodgers. I'm also going to stay away from Sonny Gray against Texas. And probably staying away from Springs against LA. I know that LA can be really terrible at times, but occasionally with Trout back especially and Ohtani both batting, there's a pretty good chance that he's going to get rung up at least a couple times. And also Taylor Ward has some upside today for them. So I'm going to stay away from him, but you could really throw him in there if you really had to as a super cheap option. And then the pitchers that we're really going to try to target on the batting aspect are going to be Tucker Davidson for LA, Angels, Adam Ollier for Oakland, and then Cole Reagans for Texas. And then also Cincinnati, so the Philadelphia Phillies playing against Cincinnati. They're actually running out a relief pitcher. He's only going to play a couple innings at the most. So you're going to have to do kind of a bullpen game there. So that makes Philly a little bit harder to figure out. But overall, that's pretty much what we have for the pitchers. I do tend to like bullpen games with Philly, so you have to consider some of those guys. So at catcher, I have two really good options, and then I have two cheap options for you. And the two really good options are going to be William Contreras and Will Smith. And not Wilson, William. He's for Atlanta. It's hard to get. Sometimes I get those two guys mixed up. But this is the Atlanta catcher. He's been really good this season. He's also been pretty good as of late. He really doesn't get out. He doesn't get through a game without goose egg very much this season, and he's actually a little. His price has gotten up a little bit at $4,200, but he's cheap enough that you can still afford him with the pitchers. And he's probably the best option on the board outside of Will Smith, who obviously is Will Smith. However, he does have a pitching matchup that's a little bit tougher. But overall, I still think he's a really solid pick. If you want to pay up for the catcher, then he's going to be the one you probably want to pay up for. If you want two cheap options, there's not a whole lot that I like in catching, besides those top two. But Gary Sanchez is one of the guys I tend to like. He has home run potential, and that's what I look for a catcher. And then also Mejia for Tampa Bay. He's just got a good upside for. He's been pretty solid the last 10 games. He's been getting hits and stuff like that. That can't hurt you. And he's pretty cheap. And he's also against Tucker Davidson, so that's a bonus. That's pretty much what I have at catcher. Not a whole lot to look at there, just because there's not a ton of good options, but there are a couple. At first base, we have a lot of good options. First base tends to be like this, and so we have several really good choices. My top three picks are going to be Nate Lowe, who you probably heard me talk about before. He actually had a home run yesterday. Where did he go? He's going to be one of the top options. He's been hitting the ball really well as of late. He's 10.6 fantasy points the last 10 games. My other option is going to be Jose Miranda, and he's been hitting the ball pretty well as well. He's at 8.2%, 2 points the last 10 games. Both those guys have really good, solid options. The third is going to be Daniel Vogelbach, who has been hitting the ball well, but he's probably the third best of those three, but he's still a good option, and he's in the same ballpark price-wise. I also have a fourth guy who probably a little bit weaker, but he's got a good matchup, and he doesn't really hit home runs, but he does get points, and that's kind of the idea in DFS, is to score as many points as possible. Harold Ramirez against Tucker Davidson again. You're going to see a lot of guys going up against Tucker Davidson probably today. So he's a pretty decent option. He's pretty inexpensive at $3,400. And then I have one Hail Mary option, and that is Mr. Pujols, who is, hunting for home runs, and he's been heating up as of late. But you do have to be aware he can get 30 fantasy points, and you can also get 3 or 0. And so he's very kind of hit or miss on that perspective. If he goes crazy, though, he can win you a lineup. So he's super risky. Of course, he's only $2,000. And if you pay up for the pitchers, you might want to throw a Hail Mary at first base with Pujols and see what happens. My top expensive play here is going to be Hoskins for obvious reasons. He's going against a bullpen game, and he hasn't been as good as of late, but he's still averaging 7.4. I'm sorry, not 7.4, 8.3 games. Sorry, in the last 10. Even though he's had a couple bad games the last 4 games, he's still probably a decent play today against Cincinnati. Again, first base is loaded, so you have lots of good options, and you can just take your pick based on how you do your pitching and how much money you need to save and stuff like that. At second base, we really only have 4 guys that I've looked at. My top 2 guys are going to be Luis Arias and Jorge Polanco, both from Minnesota against Texas. Both of these guys, they do hit the ball pretty well, but Luis Arias is probably more likely to get some hits, and then Polanco is going to be more likely to hit a home run. He doesn't have the batting average that Arias does, obviously, but he has some home run potential, and he does sometimes, get 7 to 8 fantasy points, so he won't hurt you too bad usually, but those are the 2 guys that you need to think about the most. Two options that are cheap alternatives are going to be Von Grisham. He has just been tearing the ball up as he starts his career. Out of 12 games he's played, he's only had 2 games where he didn't score any, didn't get a hit. And he even scored fantasy points, I think, in one of them, if not both. Yeah, he scored in both. So, and he's averaging 395 right now, and he's got 3 home runs in those 12 games. So he's got home run potential. He also has stealing the base potential, and he's got an easier matchup today, which he's been going up against a lot of really good pitchers throughout this tear that he's on. So it's not like he's doing that against like low-level teams. The Braves have been playing a really high quality schedule, and he's been one of the top tier players along with Michael Harris. So, and then my other option, who's a little bit cheaper than the top two guys, and is more expensive than Grayson, is Kevin Newman. I've probably showed you him a couple times. He's got a good batting average, and he can get hits and stuff. And he's been averaging 7.2 the last 10 games, so he does score points, but he doesn't hit home runs. You do have to be aware of that. So if I was gonna like rank those guys, I would probably go Arias, Polanco, Grisham, and then Newman. But maybe even put Grisham at the top. Just depends. Hard to say. It's when you have young guys, it's still pretty risky. But at any rate, that's what I have at second base. Not a whole lot there. Same with third base. Not a ton available that's great, but you got a couple really good options. One being Yandy Diaz, and another being Jose Miranda. I believe that Jose Miranda also plays at first base, and so he sometimes, if you want to get him in and then a different first baseman, you can put him at third. Yandy Diaz is the guy who can score points without hitting home runs, which is always a nice thing. His batting average is pretty good, and he's also against Tucker Davidson, so that's some upside. And then another option that you have that's a little bit cheaper if you need it is Gio Urshela against Texas. He has home run potential. He's been a little bit hit and miss the last few games, but he's still a pretty solid player. And so you can't really, if you need to save money, then that might be your best play. And then for my expensive option, if you can afford it, if you go for some cheaper pitchers or something, then you could throw in Austin Riley, who's been, he's been a little bit hit or miss as of late, but he's kind of due for some big games. Having probably one of the easiest matchups he's had in a while, so we can give him an opportunity potentially at third base. So that's pretty much all I have for third base. Like I said, not a whole lot there, but there's some good players that you can choose from, and you can definitely up your first base usage if you just want to throw Jose Miranda in third base and then use somebody else. At shortstop, we actually are really limited, I feel like, today. Not a ton of guys that I like. My top two are going to be Dansby Swanson and Carlos Correa. Both of these guys have high upside and can hit the ball well and score fantasy points. I probably like Dansby a little bit more just because of the matchup, but you can't really go wrong with either one, though they are quite expensive. The only real cheap option that I really like was Kevin Newman, who again can play second base. So if you want to, utilize somebody else, but need to, pay down, say you want Von Grisham, but you need to pay down at shortstop as well, you can throw Kevin Newman in here. And like I said, there's not a whole lot at shortstop that I really think is great. There's always obviously a lot of good players that play shortstop, but as far as scoring points, you could throw a dart at O'Neal Cruz, but I really wouldn't recommend it. I thought he might start breaking out of a slump soon, but he really hasn't. Or Dozy is a pitcher that, you can get hits against, though. But, man, his batting average is really tanking, so I might just stay away from him. But anyway, that's what I have for shortstop. Probably the weakest position outside of third base. And so, you're going to have to be kind of crafty, especially if you pay up for pitchers there. And outfield, we have, I think, 7 really good options, and then we have some cheap options and some expensive options for you. And I'm just going to, run through the players quickly. Manuel Margot, he doesn't really hit home runs, but he gets on base. Then we have Brian Reynolds, who is hit or miss, but he does have good potential against Atlanta. Tyler O'Neill, kind of in the same boat as Brian Reynolds. he can really, hit the ball well, and he can have some big games. Randy Arozarania, he's against Tucker Davidson. Sorry for butchering his name. He's got good home run potential today. Michael Harris is going to be one of the cheaper players that I found today, actually, who's really got good potential against Pittsburgh. And then obviously Ronald Acuna Jr. is a good option because he's obviously Ronald Acuna, and he's been really playing really well as of late. Another guy that I like too is Nick Castellanos against Cincinnati. He's been really good the last 10 games, so he's got some potential there. As for some cheap plays, if you need to pay down some more, Harold Ramirez, Taylor Ward are both two decent options that you have. And also Harold Ramirez can play first base, so if you were like you at first base, you can move him to one of your outfield positions. Though you just have to realize he's not going to really hit home runs often, but he's going to have a really good batting average. And Taylor Ward, he has some risk because the LA Angels suck, but he has a pretty decent option today from the pitching perspective, so you could throw him in there. And he does seem to be a little bit underpriced for what he's at $3,800. And then for some super cheap options, some dart throws, Jake Fraley, who at 6 of the last 8 games, he's got over 10 fantasy points, and he's been just smashing the ball. So if you need to pay down for some guy, he's $2,500. He's a good one. And then also Lars Nootbaar for St. Louis against the Cubs. He's also $2,500, and 4 of the last 5 games, he's been over 10 fantasy points, and he's also had 3 of those over 20. And so those two guys are probably going to be the top 2 guys when it comes to paying under $2,500. They're right at $2,500. If you just need to pay down because you paid a lot for pitching, then here's where you're going to go. And then if you have some money and you want to pay up and add to Acuna, you could go with Schwarber or Byron Buxton. Both those guys have good matchups and have good situations. So that's pretty much what I have for this position. I have a lot of guys at that position, obviously, because you have 3 spots, and there's plenty of good options available. So if you do like my picks, thanks for liking, commenting, and subscribing. If there's anybody that you see that you don't think I covered that you think is fairly good, feel free to leave that in the comments below. And have a nice day, guys.